Great, thanks, Evan. Scano Sabaguego, Amy Lickers Nigiaso. Thank you for having me with you today. My name is Amy Lickers. I'm from Six Nations of the Grand River Territory, which is in Ontario. We are about 100 kilometers to the west of Toronto. I'm pleased to be able to be joining you. I want to acknowledge your homelands as well, too, in the area and the homes that you are in today. It's interesting times where I can be in my home and you can be in your home and we're all having a conversation. So that's the nice thing about technology. I would like to open up the meeting today with an opening prayer and some comments by Elder Jean Sutherland. Elder Sutherland, you're still on mute. So if you look at the bottom, the right-hand corner of
Kelly,
there you go.
am I on?
Oh, shit. Yeah, we can hear you.
Oh, okay. Good morning, everybody. I actually don't have too much to say for the opening remarks, but I'll do what I can. The only thing I want to say is I think we need to listen to our own water keepers. They are the protectors of our water. The lakes, rivers, sloughs, ponds, and streams are our source of water and need to be treated respectfully. Water needs to be protected for our future. On a personal note, I know for a fact it's the mining business in that northern departments that are really, really damaging our waters. I know this because my late husband was a miner and he worked in the mines up north. And he was raising cane because of all the waste that was being dumped into the lakes over there. And he got transferred out of there. He was making too much noise. So that much I know. So that was a few years ago. So I don't know if it's still going on. But I remember him saying they liked fishing on their time off, and it was just terrible to see how the fish looked. They were really damaged over there. So I don't know if the mines are still doing that, dumping their waste into those lakes. And with that, I shall do my opening prayer, which will be in Cree, which is my language. And for myself, the first thing I always say is I always thank the Creator for giving us another day, especially in this trying time right now. And I also think of the children that go to bed hungry every day, all over the world. That touches me. So with that, you help me in your own way, say your own prayer. And today for your meetings, don't forget, do it with your heart and a clear mind. And I have my own tobacco here. How mamunok tayo mau, how ni gana nas kaman kakyok takiskawi ki pemigosya, kakyok kamamok skutanos. Wistawa no te ay manik, kay sa tuskej, anak tukat, nipi kami pa pokok staya kok. And tataman, te huwa mamtaniskan huwa katawa tapsitats. Hanga mamanok tayo mau tatkiskaw awa siska kausimut enok tekatet disksotawa. Naktuh kamau nandos kaim nanak kay kantuh taket. Kay katawa mes kanawat mitsaaki. Nistanan minanitskehtek, muy poki kwenskehten nisnan papataks kanan. Yokonan maptamanas gantoten mamanok tayo mau katog mamot kanot. Ahaw.
Thank you, Elder Sutherland. I would like to invite Vice Chief David Pratt to open up the meeting with some welcoming remarks.
Kelly.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay, just double checking. Sometimes I forget to take the mute button off when I'm making some great points and I get lost. Anyhow, good morning, everybody. First of all, I just want to thank everybody for being on the call today. I want to acknowledge the elder for the opening prayer, Gene. Hi, and Naskaman for that opening prayer. And I want to acknowledge Treaty 4 territory or Treaty 6 territory that I'm calling from today, as well as all the territories for all the water technicians that are on the phone call today. I greet all of you. So I'll be real brief with my opening comments, but first of all, the 2016 federal plan to end the long-term boil water advisories on reserves in 5 years is not going to be achieved. A lot of this was compounded by the fact that we've been dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic. The plan will expire here in March 2021. And these engagements over the next 2 days are so crucial and important to us providing development for the next phases of the plan in terms of water. We know that water is a very, very important integral part of First Nations culture, life, our connection to it, and the very important part of we also acknowledge our water carriers today, our women, as a part of that process. Many of them are very passionate about this issue because they realize how important it is, and as well as our leadership. Chief Pegan and many others within the region, Chief Shaboyer, are very, very adamant about the importance of developing these regulations, but also protecting and making sure that water is sustainable over the course of the next 50 to 100 years. In Saskatchewan region, the FSM has been working to support First Nations care and control of water by responding to concerns from the technicians and leaders on the current ISC water protocols and guidelines that have contributed to the water crisis in so many First Nations. I want to acknowledge the good work of our technicians, Kevin McLeod, and the great work that you're doing, as well as our regional water technicians. We've coordinated development of First Nations water and wastewater regulations that are intended to protect human health and are achievable with IBRAM technology already in use in several Saskatchewan First Nations. These regulations could potentially form a part of the work happening today on repealing or replacing the Safe Drinking Water for First Nations Act, which is unfortunately a legacy of the Harper government that is still hanging around. We are also hoping to establish a provincial association for First Nations and wastewater operators and technicians to support the essential role they play in our communities. In Saskatchewan, ISC has said they've lifted 16 long-term water advisories since 2016. As of the end of February, there are 9 water advisories in place on Saskatchewan First Nations. 3 are recommended to be lifted, and 3 were issued in January. Also, there are 3 that do not consume orders in place resulting from equipment failures. From this, it may look like the issue is almost solved, but ISC's 2016 plan only addressed water treatment plants, when many water advisories in Saskatchewan are caused by issues outside the plants. What we need, in addition to regulations that work and support for essential workers, is a massive investment in infrastructure. For example, the vast majority of homes on reserve with cisterns are on continuous boil water advisories. This represents a long-term aggregated cost to families, programs, and services that far exceeds the short-term savings ISC may achieve by not running low-pressure lines to these homes. This issue should be remembered when developing a new plan. We want ISC to make a more holistic, outcomes-based approach to funding that respects treaty and protects families and communities instead of trying to take costs, which is what led to the drinking water crisis in the first place. Anyways, I just want to start off with those opening comments, and I want to thank all of you for the great work that you're doing. I wish you the best today on your discussions and your breakout sessions today and tomorrow. We look forward to a good plan moving forward, particularly when it comes to something as important as water here, which is something that the Federation considers one of their most paramount issues, along with many others. But thank you so much. Keep up the great work, and those are my opening comments. Hi, Mercy Cho.
Thank you so much for those opening comments, Vice Chief Pratt. It sounds as though our work here is done because he solved all of the problems in his opening comments there. Great words. Thank you. I'm going to turn the presentation over to Irving LeBlanc. Irving, if you want to give us an update on the work that AFN is doing.
Thank you. Thank you, Amy. First of all, I want to thank Elder for the opening prayer. Jimmy Wetch, Kidian. I also want to thank and acknowledge Vice Chief Pratt for comments about all the work that we're doing together, and for a common good, common cause. I want to acknowledge that in the territories that you are, acknowledge the territories of Treaty 2, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 treaty areas, a home of the Dene, Cree, Saulteaux, Dakota, Lakota, Nakota, and Anishinaabe. But I also want to just want to make it clear at the start that we fully respect what the regions are doing in terms of their own work on looking at authorities, regulations, and so we fully respect that, and certainly do not want to impinge on that, the work that we do on a national level. So recognize the work that you're doing. Want to welcome all the chiefs, leadership, counselors, technicians, some I recognize there from previously, and especially to any women that are in the group, are keepers of water. So, miigwech bing lablang ini indishnikas wikwem kung donjaba adawa andao gizi indodem nibi ganin takom dan mino kinagego or the edge buying we go man mikanan skode kinagego and takom dan. Want to want to thank again. My name is Irving LeBlanc, or better known as Bing. I'm from Wikwemkong unceded territory up on Mantoulin Island, north shore of Georgian Bay, the North Channel, big island there, Kachimnising, and Nidomnising, actually. We Mantoulin Island. I want to thank Kevin and his team for pulling this together. It looks like we have a really good turnout. It's awesome, pretty amazing. And I'll do a bit of an update or a kind of a recall of where we are today, where we've been. I want to, as a reminder, I guess we've been here before on safe drinking water for First Nations engagements back in 2019, and also towards the end of 2019, long-term drinking water strategy and engagements. But not only that, we also had engagements on operation and maintenance, O&M. Where do you want to go from that? And those three topics of discussion are so intrinsically related and impact one another. So as most of you who follow this, the Safe Drinking Water for First Nations Act was developed by Harper government, as Vice Chief Pratt rightly pointed out. It was developed without consultation, and in spite of extensive First Nations resistance to it and challenges seen with it, it was put into force it was put through the Senate, and it was put into force in November 2013. Still in force, and as some people have characterized it in the past, it is a dangerous legislation, as you all know. The regulations have not been developed. No work has been done on it, even though it's been 8 years, 2013 to 2021. Engagements for a modification of the Safe Drinking Water Act by ISK and INAC and ANSI at that time began in mid-June 2017 and proceeded until September of 2017 of that year, despite calls from those engagements to cease by First Nations. True to form, ANSI, I guess at that time, ISK, they still kept on going. They still want to go on consultations with First Nations in spite of all the objections raised by the Chiefs Assembly and other regional organizations. The federal government has made clear commitments to ensure First Nations have equity with non-First Nations in terms of water quality standards and equity in water access. 2017-2018, they have now acknowledged that the First Nations-led process to deal with the current legislation is needed. And the commitments there were about equity, is talking about comparability, which they talk about a lot, but they don't really follow it. And one of the main things that were brought up by their senior staff was saying, this is the Safe Drinking Water for First Nations Act is not about rights, water rights, treaties. They kept saying it's about health and safety. And they tried to stay within a narrow discussion of technical and reporting and monitoring issues. So in spite of that, Assembly of First Nations with support from the Chiefs Assembly, as we always say that anything we do at the Assembly of First Nations is supported, mandated by resolutions, and that's what gives us our direction to do the work that we need to do. Around that time, 2018, 4 resolutions were passed on safe drinking water related matters, reflecting substantial results of sustained First Nations advocacy, which shifted the approach of the federal government on the Safe Drinking Water for First Nations Act. And one of the things that I am happy about is they've stopped using repeal and replace, but they're already starting to talk about replace of the Safe Drinking Water Act. So I think they're getting the message. Resolution 26, 2017, Safe Drinking Water for First Nations Act, repeated the call for repeal of the Safe Drinking Water Act and immediate cessation of the federal government's engagement sessions for amendment of the Act, and instead call for federal government to develop, in partnership with First Nations, the next step in engaging with the Safe Drinking Water First Nations Act. So that's basically brings us to where we are today. Two other resolutions, 88, 2017, First Nation-led engagement process for safe drinking water legislation, directed the AFN to establish a joint working group comprised of AFN Chiefs Committee on Housing and Infrastructure, the regional technicians, federal representatives, legal counsel for AFN and federal government, and other experts as necessary to co-develop a draft framework for new legislation. So on the march or the process of getting that support, this resolution gave us the go-ahead to establish a working group and essentially setting up the table of the co-development for a draft framework. And we want to make sure that we have the same representation on our side of the table as the government has, but we all know that the federal government has, as they boasted before, they have 20 lawyers in their Department of Justice working on legislation. So, but we're going to do our best to make sure that we're got our side of the table lined up. Resolution 1, 2018, First Nations-led process to develop new federal safe drinking water legislation, took this process even further and mandated the Assembly, First Nations to immediately communicate to the federal government that in keeping with the government's commitments to reconciliation, the First Nations, a joint legislative co-development process and mandate will proceed in full partnership with First Nations, including the development of, I mentioned before, the joint working group on safe drinking water for First Nations. So all of these resolutions getting stronger and giving us more support and mandates to keep on going. On Resolution 1, 2018, as per direction, we responded to develop a Chiefs Committee on First Nations Safe Drinking Water legislation, a draft First Nations Safe Drinking Water preliminary concepts, and we'll be looking at those again today. Presentation of the preliminary concept to the Chiefs Assembly at the HEA in Vancouver 2018. And time has passed. Time actually moves fast along these things. Already, when those were presented to this Chiefs Assembly 2018. Resolution 26, 2018, support for First Nations safe drinking water legislation, preliminary concepts. Those preliminary concepts were supported by the Chiefs Assembly as a working document to support the engagement. And again, as I said, we'll be presenting those to you and looking for more input on it, looking at it, what's missing, what's lacking, what needs to be added to it. Further directs the AFN to proceed with national engagement to develop a new safe drinking water legislation. And this is part of it. And this is not the end of it. We will still continue to engage with you and other regions as we move forward on the development of that draft framework. Directs the AFN to advocate for co-development of this legislation in a manner that affirms and ensures First Nations rights, interests, aspiration, inherent rights and laws, standards, guidelines, and processes are protected, which is far different from what was in their original act. Had none of those. They kept saying it's not about rights, it's about health and safety. Well, health and safety is important, but our right to water, right to manage, right to protect water is as important. So the 2019 engagements were held, as I said, in 2019. We traversed across the country to get those through, discuss further elements of the proposed repeal and replacements, and the key elements, I guess, of those discussions, which are coalescing into 5 main topics: rights and responsibilities, water governance, transboundary issues, financing, and standards for the provision of water and sanitation. Some of those things that we heard a lot about, those were at those sessions. Financing is very important. Where is the money? Show us the money to be able to implement the legislation. So what are the next steps? Looking at the rest of this year and into the following year, 2022. In the short term, continue to work on finalize the joint working group terms of reference on the safe drinking water for First Nations, and we've quite far ahead on that. They're almost at the end of that. Obviously, it needs back and forth with our federal partners because it's a joint working group. Carry out national, regionally led engagement process, part of this. And again, thanks to Kevin for arranging the pre-engagement session in February. It's all part of that, trying to get coming back to you and get more information to make sure that we got everything covered off. Obviously, we can't never cover off everything, but we certainly hope to get as much of it covered off from your input and your advice. And we developed with our current facilitator here, I'll put a plug for him. They helped, we worked with them to develop some expert videos, which are very good background by experts on each of the key topics we'll be talking about. For the long term, the 6 to 24 months going into 2022, probably summer, continue proceeding with co-development of the draft framework, presentation of draft framework to the Chiefs Assembly, submission of draft framework to cabinet via another co-developed memo to cabinet as a basis for drafting instructions. New legislation passed by the government, likely mid 2022, depends when they're in session, I suppose. I think everything revolves around when they're in session. And it will be, we have been informed that it will be introduced in the House, not in the Senate. And then upon ratification, advocacy support for regional regulatory development to implement. And that's going to be a very important stage of that, which you will be very interested. And I know that there's already some preliminary work being done here. And that's really great to see that there is anticipation of that time moving forward. So at this point, if we can entertain some questions before we move on to introducing Delaney Murphy from AFN, who will walk us through the rest of the presentations. Amy?
Are there any questions regarding Bing's presentation so far? So I'm going to invite you, if you do have any questions throughout the day, please feel free to raise your hand with the reactions button, or you can also pop them into the chat section. The way that this is going to work today is that we have a couple of different engagement tools that we're using. One of them is called Menti, and the link for Menti has been put into the chat section. So what will happen is that you can either use this QR code or you can go to the link in the chat, and there's a series of questions there that we're going to ask you to respond to. And we will use those questions for feedback and also to help generate more dialogue. Just referring back to Bing's presentation, the purpose of today is to really get your perspectives on how to move forward, really trying to assist the AFN in the drafting of the framework that will be presented to the Chiefs in Assembly in December, and then also to help moving forward with that memorandum to cabinet that will be presented as well too. So we're really hoping to have a good dialogue, and by the sounds of the comments provided by Vice Chief Pratt, you've done quite a lot of work in your region, so that's really amazing, and it would be really great to hear your perspectives on how to help structure the federal legislation in a way that will support the work being done in the regions. So with that said, if there's no questions, I'm just going to do a quick scan here, see if there's any questions so far.
Amy, we have Dr. Al Mamun unmuted, so just want to double check to see, Doctor, do you have any questions or anything?
Oh, no. I think I was wondering, like, if I ask a quick question, that is, it is always a good thing to like collaborate with other organizations to have some of their feedback on the, like, it is my understanding that if they have anything to say, let's say Global Water Forum or something, it is always a good idea to have some sort of collaboration with the type of works they also do. So I think that is all I was trying to say. Thank you.
Okay. That's great in feedback. Thank you so much. So AFN does work with a number of different organizations and a number of different experts related to water. What will happen today is that we're going to provide a bit of a presentation. Delaney is going to go through some of the options that are being presented across the country. And there's also a number of different expert videos. So you'll have the opportunity to see what some of the experts are saying regarding this legislation and then also provide the feedback. So right now what will happen, Delaney is going to give us an overview of the options that have already been prepared for your consideration. We'll watch some expert videos, and then we're going to break out into 2 breakout rooms for some greater dialogue. So at that point in time, if you have any comments to make about the options, any kind of suggestions going forward for the AFN, we'll capture those within the notes being taken. and be able to assist the AFN in going forward. So you'll see some of those expert videos coming up. Is there any other questions before we move forward? Okay, Delaney, I will leave it in your wise hands.
Awesome. Thanks, Amy. And thanks, Bing, for providing that context. So we're going to start with the discussion with our first topic today about rights and responsibilities. So as Bing was saying, in 2019, the AFN conducted national engagement on some of the really complex issues associated with repealing and replacing the Safe Drinking Water for First Nations Act with something that's First Nations led. And what we heard from the regions and from First Nations from across the country is kind of really incorporated into the options I'm going to present here today. And we were directed by the Chiefs in Assembly to kind of come back to the regions and refine some of these topics to really ensure that we're getting consensus on all of the options we're presenting today. So I'm just going to walk you through some of the options for each of kind of the key components we're going to discuss today. And then we're going to have an opportunity to hear from you as well, which we're really looking forward to. So topic number one is going to be rights and responsibilities. So option one, which we presented in 2019, was to not characterize Aboriginal rights whatsoever to water in the legislation. This was not favored in any region, so it was deemed not viable. So we're not even going to talk about this today. So we're really going to focus on these other two options. So option two is to characterize Crown and First Nations water rights directly in the legislation. So this would provide some certainty to all parties. It provides a clear link between the rights and responsibilities of the Crown and First Nations and creates a clear, strong legal standard and precedent. A con to this option, though, is it could be complex to negotiate, particularly in the form of a statute with national reach. It has a significant potential to create a legal precedent, and it also could lead to having a high possibility of litigation. And it also risks creating a crystallization of rights and title that doesn't let them grow and adapt to new situations. So there are a lot of advantages to this approach because it is a strong approach, but it also risks kind of creating this position that we could be stuck in. So this option was favored by participants, but it was also recognized that it would be difficult to implement, which leads me to option three, which is to characterize Crown and First Nations rights in an aspirational form. So such as in something like a preamble, which would come at the beginning before kind of in the introduction to the legislation, with a strong non-derogation and non-abrogation of rights clause in the body of the legislation. So it would still also be a pretty strong approach. A pro to this was that it would be easier to negotiate than option two. It's non-binding and helps create some guidance to all parties while also clearly signaling that First Nations do have and have always had and continue to assert rights over the subject matter without committing nations to definitions for all time and purpose. So it allows for a bit more flexibility. It allows for this to change depending on the context. However, there also are some cons to this approach because it's non-binding. There's kind of the flip side of that. It's aspirational and does leave a bit of uncertainty as to powers and jurisdiction. And it's been also recognized from what we heard from the regions that this approach could be just postponing a difficult discussion that must be had at some point in order to ensure safe drinking water for all First Nations, no matter where they are in the country. So this was an option that was also favored by participants, but it was also recognized that it probably needs to be reworded. So given that, next slide, please. So we're going to watch two expert videos, one by Danica Littlechild and one by Amanda Classing, who are going to dive a bit deeper into this issue of rights and responsibilities. And we're going to come back to this question, but just so you can think about it for now, the question that we're going to discuss is the new legislation should characterize First Nations water rights in a direct or aspirational form, such as in a preamble, with a strong non-derogation and non-abrogation of rights clause in the body of the legislation, with no mention of Crown rights. So given that, we're going to watch a couple of videos. Thank you.
Thank you. What a great video. Before we break out into our breakout rooms, is there anything that needs clarifying before we move into our breakout rooms? I'm just going to ask if you can use your raise hand because we have so many participants. It's sometimes hard to tell who has something to say. Okay, so we're going to go into our breakout rooms and we're going to concentrate on discussing the third option that Delaney had presented, which was characterizing First Nation rights in direct or aspirational forms. So essentially, what sorts of things could be put, what sorts of things should be put in the framework or the memorandum to cabinet when they're drafting the First Nations water legislation? What sorts of things would align with the work that you're already doing in your region? Okay, so we're going to go into our breakout rooms now. One group is going to stay with myself. The second group is going to go in with Melissa, and we're just going to talk about this option for the next 20 or 25 minutes. Okay.
Okay, great. I'm going to open up the breakout rooms right now. The one other thing I'd like to add is if you're able to, if you could please turn on your camera just to help promote a good discussion in your breakout rooms. Thank you.
Okay, we'll get started again. Just to, as a reminder, we had a request for the documents. So if I just put the link for the documents in the chat, there's a number of different documents there. All of the AFN resolutions. There's some information regarding the annual water symposium. And then there's other documents in there as well too, like the concept paper, the backgrounder, and the repeal and replace document. So anything you need can be found on that web link. So just to go back, are we able to pull up the Menti results? I just want to show some of that feedback that we've got from the Menti poll. So the question on the Menti is, do you agree that the new legislation should characterize First Nations water rights in direct or aspirational form? So there was a number of people that said, 4 people said yes, 2 people said maybe, and 1 person said no. And is there anyone that voted that wanted to share some of their comments regarding that? Can we go to the next Menti poll? Let's see what we've got. A word bubble going on there. So what are your biggest concerns? Inadequate funding, definitely a huge concern. Aspirational statements. In terms of aspirational statements, are you just concerned that it's not going to be concrete enough? It'll be too aspirational and not implementable? More qualified operators capacity is definitely an issue. First Nations they're not strong enough language. That makes sense. Title is better. That's great. So as I said, you can continue to provide your feedback through Menti all day, and that'll be open until the end of the session. So any kind of comments you have, please feel free to put them in there. Evan, are participants able to go back after they've gone through Menti? Can they go back to other questions?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure. Yeah, they can go back to previous questions. And I think Menti will take them through one at a time. So you have to answer the first question to get to the next question. Okay.
All right. Perfect. All right. So please feel free to continue checking out the Menti site. Next on deck, we have our next topic, which is water governance. And I'm going to look to Delaney again to provide us a bit of commentary on the water governance section.
Awesome. Thanks, Amy. Yeah, so now we're going to discuss water governance. So next slide, please. So same as before, I'm going to go through all of the options that were presented in 2019 along with some of the feedback at the bottom that we got. So I'm just going to start off by noting that option 4, which was to not engage the water governance arrangements at all in the legislation, was not favored in any region. It was deemed not viable. So we're not even talking about this one anymore. So we're going to focus on the other 3. So option 1 would be to create a water governance approach and structure, something like a First Nations Water Commission directly in the legislation. So right from the get-go, this would be something that would be included in the legislation. So a pro to this approach would be that it provides certainty and clarity to all parties. As well, it could really improve and build on First Nations institutional capacity. It can be structured to support local, regional, and national approaches, and ensures that safe drinking water is in the hands of First Nations. Although a con to this approach is that if improperly created, it may restrict flexibility and local innovative approaches that are occurring, for example, at your regional level. And it may be prejudicial to First Nations existing structures and work in progress. So the feedback we heard in 2019 was to consider blending this with option 2. So option 2 is to create a high-level approach and structure for First Nations water governments to be able to let it grow organically at the national level using a First Nations Water Commission. So this is kind of like a in-between approach. So it balances certainty and clarity with options to evolve organically. So it's not set in stone. It allows it to kind of change according to the context. So it allows some national level governance with room for local approaches, as well as helps to build on capacity as well. But something to keep in mind is that it could create a centralized system that some nations or regions don't actually want. It could also have strong opposition from provincial or territorial governments. So it needs to be approached carefully to ensure that any delegation of authority to a centralized commission is not used to undercut the Crown's fiduciary responsibilities. And also to make sure it doesn't take away inherent jurisdiction and authority away from individual nations or diverting any of this funding. Because what we saw in the current legislation that exists with the Safe Drinking Water for First Nations Act, this is definitely a risk that it played. So we really want to avoid this in anything that we create now. So this was the kind of approach that we could consider blending with option 1. So it would have kind of that national level structure, but still allows for a bit more local flexibility. Option 3 would be to create an opt-in approach to exercising water governance. So this really allows for local variability in readiness of First Nations. So each nation could make the choice. Do we want to opt into this? At what point do we want to do it? Do we want to do it at all? So it really allowed for each nation to decide what works best for them. But a con to keep in mind of this approach is that it could create a patchwork of systems and approaches. So this approach was somewhat favored. So now we're going to listen to or watch a video by Marilyn Fair, who's one of our legal advisors, who's going to really break down this kind of different governance approaches in a good way. And the question we're going to contemplate for discussion after the videos is the new legislation should create a high-level approach and structure for First Nations water governance with an opt-in approach to be considered. And also that should a water commission be explored. So thank you.
Great. I really like that video, and I want to point out a few things before we go into our breakout rooms again. One is when Meryl was talking about the rights exist, I find that really impactful, and it's something to remember going forward is that the government doesn't give any of the First Nations the rights because we already possess them. They are inherent rights that we already hold. So this legislation has nothing to do with giving any First Nation the right. It's already there. What this legislation will do is it provides a mechanism for the federal government to flow funds that they're receiving. So the government gets money through their revenues. This provides them the direction of how they're to flow those funds. Okay, so that's one thing to keep in mind as we go forward. And we're going to go into our breakout rooms and we're going to discuss. Can we bring up that last slide again that shows the discussion topic? Or the discussion question. So the question that we're going to go in and discuss in the breakout room is about creating a high-level approach and structure for the governance. And Meryl provided 3 different options. There was status quo, there was cooperative, and then there was collaborative. And then there was also 3 different how to do those things. All right. And that was building, each First Nation building their own institution. There was a regional approach, and then there was also an approach that was national, regional, and local. So these are some things that we're gonna go into our breakout rooms to discuss. As always, feel free to make your comments in the Menti. Yeah, we will go into our breakout sessions now.
Okay, the rooms are open, so you should be heading there right now, or you can click the join button.
Hi, everyone. As you're coming back, if you can just either turn on your camera or put the little thumbs up sign so we know that you're back and ready to go.
Yeah, and Colin, would you be able to go ahead and share the Menti polls? Amy, did you want to share the polls from the results from the last breakout?
Yes, please. So the question that we looked at last session was, do you agree that the new legislation should create a high-level approach and structure for First Nations water governance? And with an opt-in approach. So there was 3 said yes, 2 said maybe. And can we see the next slide as well too? Should a water commission be explored? Again, 3 yes, 1 maybe. We did have some good conversation in our session, our group, about what the governance should look like in the region, or could look like in a region. That was really good. So I hope the other group also had some great conversation. And can we see the word bubble for the last section? Oh, an opt-in approach, sorry. Okay. 2 and 2 and 1 for no opt-in. All right. And then, oh, there's no word bubble. All right. My apologies. Okay, how was everyone's lunch? Did you get something to eat? Everyone have a good lunch? Have some water? Everyone have a big gulp of water? So the next topic of discussion is transboundary governance. And I just want to make sure Delaney's on board here. Is Delaney here?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, great. So we'll look again to Delaney to share the information with us, and we'll watch some videos.
Awesome. So we're gonna discuss transboundary governance now. So next slide, please. So same as before, we're just going to go through these options presented with some of the pros and cons, as well as the feedback that we heard before. So I'll just begin with the one that you can see crossed out. So option 3 was to not acknowledge First Nations jurisdiction in the legislation whatsoever. So this was an option we presented in 2019. This was not favored in any region. So this is not a viable option. So we're not going to be talking about this one. So we're going to focus on the other 2 options that we see here. So option 1 would be to confirm that the legislation supports First Nations exercising their jurisdiction and protects off-reserve source water through agreements made with other Crown governments. So the pros to this approach would be that the agreements would provide sufficient mutually agreed clarity to ensure source waters are protected, not defining First Nations jurisdiction, just acknowledging their power to make agreements with Crown governments. So this clause does not endanger a federal overreach into provincial jurisdiction. So it's kind of like a bit of a more safer option. The cons to this approach is that agreement is not mandatory, and so may be exceedingly difficult to negotiate with oppositional provincial governments. Because as we know, every region has really different relationships with their provincial governments that they work with. So this would kind of leave that up a little bit. So this approach was somewhat favored. Option 2, which was the most favored approach that we're going to dive in a bit deeper today, is to set out First Nations jurisdiction to protect source waters off reserve. So in this case, First Nations jurisdiction is acknowledged, it's implementable, and avoids future litigation down the road to implement jurisdiction because it's already right there. The cons to this approach is that it's likely to be opposed by provinces and territories, and this provision could be seen and would be likely be seen as federal overreach without provincial or territorial agreement. So it's definitely the most stronger approach going forward, but this was also the most favored. So with that in mind, next slide, please. So we're going to be watching an expert video by Teresa McClenahan, who's an environmental and water-focused lawyer based out of Toronto. And the question we're going to be looking at is the new legislation should clearly set out First Nations jurisdiction to protect source waters off reserve. So with that, we'll watch the video. Thank you.
Great video. So I did post the 2 websites that she mentioned into the chat box. The SELA.ca is there and the SELAfoundation.ca if you're looking for any additional information from that video. So we're going to go back into our breakout groups again, and we're going to discuss about clearly setting out First Nations jurisdiction to protect source waters off reserve. All right, so what could that look like? What kinds of mechanisms can be put in place to support that? So we will go into our breakout groups, and then we'll come back to the plenary in a little bit of time.
Okay, I'm going to open up the breakout rooms right now. Just a reminder, if you're able to please turn on your camera. And so we're going to have a good discussion. Thanks.
First Nations jurisdiction. Oh, there we go.
Hey, sorry, did you want to finish that thought, Melissa? Oh, Melissa, you're muted. Sorry, I'm just going to, okay, go ahead.
Oh, there we go. No, I was just reading the questions. If they could take the time to answer those, that would be great.
Okay, great. Okay, the breakout rooms are now closed. Amy?
Thanks, Evan. Are we able to pull up the Menti polls again? We can get some feedback on these last questions here. So the question from the last section was, do you agree with the new do you agree that the new legislation should assert First Nations jurisdiction to protect source waters off reserve? So there was a yes and a maybe. And the next question, should First Nations jurisdiction be pursued at all costs in the new legislation, despite limitations that may be imposed by provinces and territories? And we had a resounding yes there. And the word bubble is, what are your key concerns about transboundary jurisdiction considerations? So alliances for profit, and this is interesting. I think we're seeing this in a lot of regions where there are water companies like Nestle that are impacting source waters. Roles and responsibilities, action-based discussion, that's great. Shared jurisdiction works, and water quality guidelines. So great feedback. Thank you, everyone that participated. And again, feel free to continue to provide your comments into the Menti section. So on the agenda, we were scheduled for a break now, but I feel like we just got back from a break. So I'm gonna, if no one is opposed, I'm gonna push to end the break after this next topic, which is funding and finance. So Delaney, if you would please share your wisdom with us on the funding and finance section.
Definitely. And just the next slide, please. Awesome. So I'm just going to walk you through the three options we have here for funding and finance. So option one would be to create a national funding mechanism, such as a First Nations Infrastructure Institute or something similar, more applicable to water, to apply to all First Nations under the legislation. This would provide certainty and clarity to all parties. It's predictable, transparent, and it's also likely to get buy-in from the Crown, at least in principle. A con to this option is that it might not be flexible enough and also may be rejected by some First Nations. What we heard from First Nations in 2019 was that this approach might be a bit too close to the status quo that we are currently in now, but it was somewhat favored by some regions. Option two was to create a partial funding arrangement that defines principles and approaches. So this could be something like a commitment to actual cost funding and asset management, but does not define specific processes for financing. So this creates some certainty while also allowing for flexibility and innovation as we're moving forward. So nothing's stuck in stone, but those aspirations are there, and there is a partial arrangement. So it could be structured as a transitional approach while a more permanent solution and our structure continues to be negotiated. The con of this is that it doesn't create a guarantee for First Nations and risks that by default administration will fall to ISK policies if there's nothing there in the meantime. And, you know, as we all know, this is frustrated First Nations aspirations and held up important projects for years, and has just led to not having access to clean drinking water. But there is some advantages to this approach as well. So this approach was somewhat favored. Option 3 would be to not address financing mechanisms at all in the new legislation. So this would be easy to achieve as it's the Crown's preferred option. But as we know, this is kind of pointless given the fact that we're trying to use this for legislative reform. So this would just be kind of really much the status quo as we're currently dealing with the Safe Drinking Water for First Nations Act, which did not set aside funding at all for this. So this was also not favored in any region, but just to give you that kind of context. So now we're going to watch a video by Kevin Page, who is one of Canada's former parliamentary budget officers, who's going to get into this issue a bit deeper. And the question that we're going to be looking at is the new legislation should create a funding arrangement or mechanism that defines approaches and principles, and that this mechanism or arrangement or approach should include funding mechanisms that commit to funding water and wastewater in its entirety. So the true cost of this, that eliminate competitive funding and evolve based on community needs. So this is what we heard really across the region in 2019. So this is the question that we're going to be discussing today, and we're eager to hear your thoughts. So thank you.
Great, thank you. So we're going to, again, go back into our breakout groups. And this time we're going to be discussing the new legislation should create a funding arrangement or mechanism that defines approaches and principles. It should include funding mechanisms that commit to funding water, wastewater in its entirety, that eliminate competitive funding and evolve based on community needs. So again, just to comment that the engagement that was done last year was focused on supporting this. So now just having more discussion about what this could actually look like and what are the details within here to help provide and guide AFN going forward. So we're going to go into our breakout groups, and then we'll meet back here after.
Okay, thanks, Amy.
Okay, we'll get started again as soon as I can make sure everyone is just check to see if we got people back. If you can either put your camera on or just give me a little thumbs up emoji, let me know that you're back. Great, 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 great. Awesome. I love seeing the thumbs up emojis. All right, so we'll get started again. Can we pull up the Menti post or the Menti poll from the last session? So the question is, do you agree that the new legislation should create a funding arrangement or mechanism that defines approach and principles? It should include funding mechanisms that commit to funding water and wastewater in its entirety, in the true cost and not arbitrary numbers, that eliminate competitive funding and evolve based on community needs. So there was the majority of people are saying yes to that. And the next question was, should a national funding mechanism be created to fund water and wastewater? Or is this too close to how things are currently being done? Oh, so this one's interesting. Interesting to see the yes and the not sure being on par there at the same level. And let's just see what the word bubble says. Some of your concerns are fiduciary duty, policy for innovative systems, great. Equality amongst other regions, also great. Yeah, we don't decide what the concerns are, so there should be a mechanism to be able to feed into priorities and economic gain. Is there someone that wants to explain economic gain? Who put that in? Even if you want to put it in the comments, if you're not comfortable with speaking in the group. Was there someone that wants to let us know what they mean by that? Again, if you want to just comment in the group, or like I said earlier, if there's any other comments you want to provide, if you think about something. Oh, great.
Sorry,
Yeah.
that was me.
Great. Can you?
Yeah, there's money to be made in water and wastewater treatment we have these huge centralized wastewater and water treatment systems. The cities make money off of it. And I don't know what ISC, and I don't think that they would support capital that will end up having economic benefits for the nations. So I think that was just like something that was in my mind was, you know, is there going to be an opportunity for First Nations to advance in treating their own wastewater treatment if our funding agency is ISC, and like maybe we don't have the resources to put up that capital initially. So I don't know, that's just where my mind was going, is just, is it going to be addressed, or is it going to even be an option?
Yeah, great comment. Thanks, Darlene. Bing, did you have a response?
Well, I was going to mention this earlier when it came up about what's a good way of putting it, making money out of water. And two First Nations, two nations in Ontario, and Amy knows them, Wata Mohawks. They have Wata water. They sell bottled water. And Akwesasne at one time had Akwesasne water, a water plant right on the nation. So it's not new, not some. It's, I don't imagine they used ISK funding to do that, but I mean, own source revenues are always there to start economic development ventures and all that. You know, some First Nations may have the benefit of having a great spring water somewhere that neighboring municipalities do not have. But a lot of that stuff really goes against what a lot of people say. Well, you should not be commodifying water. But there's two sides to it, right? Own source revenues. Nestle is gone overboard on it, and so look at Wata Mohawks and Mohawks of Akwesasne, how they do it. And I'm sure there's others that are doing it.
And so maybe a couple of other things that I could provide some insight on is here at Six Nations, we have a really large community. We have 27,000 members and 13,000 live on reserve. So we've only got about a third of our community actually is on piped water. The rest are on wells or cisterns. And two-thirds of our community still don't have reliable sources of water. So 2 points to what you're talking about, Darlene, is that those members that are on the piped water do have fee for service. So they do pay for their water that's coming in. So they pay per the amount that they use. And then there's actually also a private company in our community called Cool Kids. They might even have a website, actually, I never looked, that has set up on the water line as a business. And they've got a large reverse osmosis system where they double treat the water that's come in through the water systems. And you can go in with your big blue jugs and you can fill it up at the Cool Kids water, and they do water delivery and they do all sorts of things. So there are ways of, and again, it's like Bing's saying, there's two sides to the water access that people shouldn't be commodifying, but there are people that need the water, right? There are people in our community still that need access to the water. I do have one question from Gary. Gary, or you have your hand up? Did you want to ask a question?
Yeah, so when we're doing that, is that from the treatment plant on the reserve, or where is that from, the water coming from? Yeah.
Yeah.
So are they paying the band a portion, or how does that work?
So they pay for the use. So they pay, like I was saying, they have the fee for service. So whatever amount of money they use and their metering, they pay for, and then they they do reverse osmosis on site. And then you as the consumer will pay, like, I think I pay $3 because I'm on a well. I pay $3 for one of those jugs of water. And yeah, there it is right there. I pay for that, which is still a fraction of the cost. Like if I were to go into our nearby municipality, I would be paying $10, at least $10, $15 for one of those blue jugs. So
Interesting.
yeah, so yeah, they have it so that you can either do your own fill, or if you want it delivered, they will pay, you can pay to have them deliver it to your house. So a lot of our elders will go with that option, and they'll have the water delivered in the blue jugs right to their place. So yeah, there's some options. Is there any other questions about that section? If not, we're going to go into the next discussion of topic, which is standards and regulations. And we'll pull up the slide deck, and Delaney is going to give us the options that have been discussed.
Before I go, I just saw Darlene has her hand up. I don't know, Darlene, do you have anything else to add? After, okay.
Sure.
It sounds good. Okay, we're going to move into standards and regulations then. Next slide, please. All right, so this is our final topic of the day. So same as before, I'm just going to go through all the options. So the first option would be to set standards for operations that apply to all First Nations across Canada. So this would provide clarity and transparency to all parties, and it could allow for the streamlining of standards and processes to make operations and training easier and cheaper, because it would be the exact same across the board. This option will likely appeal to the Crown and be able to attract buy-in, and it's the most transparent way to ensure safe drinking water. It creates legal obligations that trigger funding. The cons of this approach is that nations may resist these standards. It's complex to create and negotiate a full body of standards that are the same across the board, because as we know, different regions have different issues that are going to affect like regulations and standards differently. And ignores the reality of different local conditions and interacting with different provincial regimes. As I said before, all regions have different relationships with their provincial governments. So this option was not very much favored when we presented it in 2019. Which leads me to option 2, which would be to define a process for creating regional and local standards. So this balances the national approaches with regional innovation and the definition. It utilizes the legislative reform opportunity without imposing standards on First Nations. So implementation cost to this approach might be high. It leaves some uncertainty as to outcomes, because we're not sure what that would look like from the start. And may entrench provincial or territorial boundaries and approaches and apply them to First Nations. So this approach was somewhat favored. Option 3 of not addressing standards directly in the legislation or regulations, this approach was not favored at all. This would be easily accomplished, and it would allow for nations to define for themselves their own approach. But it just totally, utterly fails to address operation standards at all. And it could also lead to creating a patchwork of standards that would be difficult to work with and difficult to kind of arise in a situation that would trigger funding where the government would have to act, and it would leave as well nations vulnerable to exploitation by third parties. Option 4, which was the most favored option, would be to define some national standards and delineate others for local regional development. So if this could be defined and developed well, this could really take the best options from option 1 and option 2 and kind of make this into a really great option. So it would allow regions and nations to adopt certain measures, so such as like water quality requirements for drinking water or engineering standards that are universally supported as national standards, and others such as source water planning, which inherently call for local input. So it would allow nations and regions to decide what suits them best and kind of come up with something based on that. So there'd be like the national standard that everyone could rely on, but then that could be, added at the local level to add to that kind of innovation or complexity, or some regions that deal with things differently than others. And it's more respectful of the autonomy of nations than single uniform standards for all elements. A con to this approach is it might be difficult to reach agreement on what some nations consider national standards that are universally applicable versus some nations that don't see it that way. So there's a potential that could lead to some like divides in the region or regional conflict. And it also might be resisted by the Crown, who looks for a single solution, and this is a bit more complex. But this was the most favored option when we presented this in 2019. So next slide, please. So given all this, we're going to watch an expert video from Phil Tangi, who's going to give a bit more of an insight into this. And the question that we're going to discuss further is the new legislation should define some standards and delineate others for local regional development. And that this approach must include reference to First Nations culture, laws, and the spiritual relationship with water as being important components of the development of water standards, which is something that Phil mentions a lot in his video. So with that, thank you.
Great video. I know that in our in the breakout group that I was in, we had a lot of discussion around capacity and the challenges that the operators are facing. And I know that we do have a number of operators on the call. So I just want to, again, extend my appreciation to the work that you do in your communities, because it's important and it's needed, and we value the work that you do. So that we're going to go back out into our breakout groups, and we're going to discuss the question. We're going to define some national standards and delineate others for local regional development. So essentially, what do you think should be national standards for water, and what should be put down to the local or regional level for development? And how can there be an inclusion of First Nations culture, laws, and spiritual relationship to the water? Where can that be input? What ideas do you have of how we can include those in standards and regulations for water? So we're going to go to our breakout groups, and then we'll come back into plenary in about 25 minutes, I believe, 20 minutes. So we'll
yeah, about 20 minutes, I think around 3 o'clock. I'll just double check the schedule.
Great.
Oh yeah, okay, 2:55, then it's time for roundtable. So maybe a little bit less than 20 minutes.
Great,
Okay,
thank
thanks.
you.
Hi everyone, welcome back. The breakout rooms are now closed.
Hi, sorry, Robin, can you unmute yourself and just finish your train of thought there? You were talking about the company that was bottling the water.
What happened? Did I do that?
Yeah, we got moved into the other group, so you got muted by.
Oh, okay. Okay, I just wanted to share my experience on regulations. This was a provincial regulation. They were on Crown land, and they were selling the water already because they knew that, you know, they're First Nations people, but they weren't on the reserve, and they had to follow provincial standards. So they got shut down until they could purchase a plant where they actually filter it through and then come out with the set standards. And I thought that was so unfair. Like, we've been drinking this water since you don't know when, and here comes the provincial government, and they're going to regulate this. If they didn't use that filtration system, they would have been shut down permanently. So they had a huge cost added to their operations. So just to give you a little bit of an angle there on standards and regulations, but they complied, and their business was done, and the elders were quite upset about it because they said the water is already good. We've always drank this water, and why does it have to go through this system? And they couldn't understand why. So I thought I'd share that. It makes it makes sense to bring in those kind of things to this picture that's in front of us.
Yeah,
Okay,
it definitely does. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. It definitely does, I think, help to bring real life examples of things that we're seeing playing out under current legislation and under the current environment. So I think when you can bring in real world situations, it helps to frame your mind around where some of the gaps are and where some of the challenges in the current environment, as I was saying. So if we can pull up the Menti questions. So this is about agreeing whether there should be, should define some national standards and delineate others from local or regional developments. So there was, I think that says 6 said yes, 1 said maybe. And the next section, the next slide, question. And some of the thought bubbles around here are some of the concerns around standards and regulations, and we heard some in our group, and I hope the other group had just as great of a conversation as we did. Some of the concerns is that it should come from the nation, and one of the comments that I wanted to make is because there was some concerns about having a national standard, but really I think what it comes down to is the phrase "nothing without us," nothing about us without us, right? So having those governance mechanisms in place so that there is direct communication with the people that are implementing the standards, right? So I think that would be an important point to bring up as well too. Standards should be developed using best practices to provide the best quality of water. Standards should recognize access to safe and healthy water as a key component in the community and individual health. Great comment. May not be able to meet them all financially, and then what? What's the plan for those that don't meet the standard? Also a great concern, and a bit of what we talked about in our group was that if you can have some sort of standards established, it becomes like a mandatory mechanism for also applying the capacity and the resources to make sure you're meeting those standards, right? Lack of policy for innovative systems, lack of climate change adaptation planning, great concern. Lack of provincial inclusion, lack of policy on funding capital projects that have economic benefits, i.e. a microgrid water treatment and wastewater treatment. Super, great comments. Thanks everyone for providing those comments. And again, the Menti pool will be open for a little bit longer if you want to continue to go to that link and provide your feedback. So we've come to this section now where we will be having a roundtable, and we do have quite a large group. I'm going to try my best to get to any comments or questions. If I'm just going to ask if you can use your hands up reaction so that I know that you have something that you would like to add. So one of the things that we would like to know now is what's missing from this conversation? What should be included in engagement and conversations going forward? Are there matters that you think are important that we hadn't addressed today? And what sorts of mechanisms can be put in place to ensure that your voice is being heard? And I had mentioned earlier that if you go away today and in a couple of days, you've had time to process and you think, oh, I really should have said this. This is something that's really important to me that I think would be valuable in going forward. Feel free to email this email that's here on the page here, and the AFN will get your comments and be able to incorporate them into the report going forward. So we do have some comments from the Menti poll. What's missing from this discussion is knowledge keepers and women as lead advisors. Great comment, because we did hear that from a couple of comments, specifically from Elder Sutherland this morning. Industry co-developed best practice management practices, cumulative impacts. Ooh, I like cumulative impacts on water and wastewater treatment plants, and alternatives to current problems. Great suggestions. Thank you for adding those. Does anyone have any additional comments that they want to add to the session today? What questions do you have about this process? Okay, so we have enforcement, and a comment that came up in our working group as well about enforcement. So that should be something that can come up going forward. Dion, did you have something you wanted to add?
Yeah, kind of the things we don't really talk about is our distribution system. We look at cisterns, the issues that we have with cisterns, not piped to the house. Water trucks, delivery of water trucks, what kind of guidelines do they have, when they're servicing the community? Do we think of the safety? Should they be cleaning it? Should they be recording that when they're cleaning it? Also, safety, when it comes to safety in the water plants. Really, we didn't talk about standards for safety in the water plants. They're just things that should protect the operator, right? So there should, like, basically security for the water plant operator, insurance or something like that. So just a couple of ideas there.
That's great, thank you. It does lead to other questions too, like employment laws. Like in the group that we were in, talking about how there's only one person, so that person can't get sick and they can't have vacation or they can't have anything like that. So looking at employment standards and how that impacts as well too. There was another question. Was it Ira? Did you have a question or comment?
I just had a comment about one of the things we didn't cover today. Water, I guess, recently has been deemed a commodity and is tradable on the stock exchange and that. So what does that mean for us as a First Nation now? Are we going to have to school ourselves on how to play the market so we get our fair share of water, or should we even be concerned about that at this time? Secondly, another thing we didn't touch on is when we were talking about funding is own source revenue that we generate on our First Nations. And if we go over a certain amount, we could be penalized by ISC as being able to sustain ourselves when really we kind of get penalized for making revenue for things that aren't covered in funding. So just those two things I wanted to bring up.
Great comments. Thank you, Ira. Before, I just want to make sure there's no other, can I get the slide taken down? Just so I can see all of the, thank you, all of the comments. Is there any other questions or comments before I go on? Yeah, I think that definitely is a concern with the own source revenue, right? And there are going to be a lot of other intersecting policies that will come into play. So taking note of them right off the hand or right off the kick, so you can keep those in your mind as you're moving forward, I think is definitely going to be helpful. In terms of water as a commodity, hopefully it's not going to get to the point where First Nations have to keep track of the stock market in order to get their fair share of resources that are within your treaty lands. And there should be other mechanisms in place to be able to deal with revenues and resource revenues that you don't have to go to the stock market. So hopefully it doesn't get to that point, but I definitely understand your concern. Is there any other comments that anyone wants to provide? Any questions in the process going forward? So now you do have another session tomorrow. There was a question about will the recording of the presentation be shared with the participants?
Yeah, we're providing the transcripts and the recording and all of everything from the chat over to AFN, and then AFN is gonna, I assume, I'm not exactly sure what AFN is going to be doing with it, but I imagine Delaney probably figuring out a plan internally on when to do, if to distribute and when to distribute.
Yep. Did you want to answer that?
Yeah, that's don't think we've really sorted out, like it's going to be they're large documents, right? And we're doing 10 regions, and we have space in there to put all of the 10 regional, like this today is 6 hours of transcripts and videos, but the Aspen group and others are going to be doing a summary report on each session. So definitely, I think those will be available on a regional basis. But
Thanks, Bing. And I think too that are the videos that we shared today being shared? The videos are being shared?
I think that's something we're working on now. It's definitely something that needs to be shared. I think, how big are they, Evan?
They're pretty big. So right now they're online, and I think along when we first started doing them, I think the plan was eventually to have them on afn.ca on the AFN official website. So I assume that's probably still the plan at some point, but it just hasn't been finalized quite yet.
Yeah, definitely. I keep listening intently to Maryland's presentation on the options. I think that's one of the best ones there, most informative ones that should be listened to over and over again.
I agree that there were some great videos in there. So Kendra, I'm going to refer you back to afnwater.ca is where all of the documents are. And it sounds like at some point there will be the videos that were shown today too. So keep an eye out for that. And thank you for suggesting your Director of Public Works comes tomorrow. So tomorrow is going to be a different session where they're talking more about strategy, right? Great.
That's long-term water and wastewater strategy.
Okay, great. Dion, did you have any?
Sorry.
Go ahead, Ed.
I just had one question. What is the goal of the legislation change that the impact it'll have on the First Nation communities?
Sorry, can you repeat that? You kind of cut out a little bit.
Oh, sorry. What is the goal, like, of the legislation change, like the impact it'll serve for the First Nation communities?
Well, I think one of the main things that we hope to come out of it is to provide support to develop regulations, whether it's a regional approach. Essentially, as I mentioned in my opening comments, we hope to have a draft legislation, which will be essentially enabling legislation, tabled probably hopefully around mid 2022 or late 2022, depending on when the Parliament what their schedule is. But it's to assure that First Nations are protected by some kind of regulatory framework that your provinces, your citizens in the provinces have, and that First Nations will have the same level of protection by having regulations and standards that they can be applied, and by having those in law will require the government to fund those meeting those standards, so that your operators, your First Nations can meet those regulations. So it's kind of a top-down. We develop the legislation, develop the regulations, and develop the standards that go with those, or find those standards that go with those regulations. And some of the options we talked about, they could be developed at the regional level, sub-regional level, and even some large First Nations. I think we heard early in these sessions that Mohawk Council of Akwesasne will be developing their own laws. Depends how big they are, how big the nations are. So it's going to take different approaches, but generally working towards the national legislation that regions can take and adapt their development of their regulations and standards to it.
Oh, thank you.
So ultimately, the goal is to make sure that the government is doing their fiduciary duty to ensure that First Nations have safe drinking water. That's the end goal. Dion, did you have something to add?
Yeah, actually, we didn't really talk too much about O&M, but feds actually promised 100%. I don't think any communities really noticed that they got any. And what does that mean for operators? But, then again, also, when it comes to O&M and KIAS. Like, we got a turnover of managers, administrators. There's quite a bit of turnover. So to understand KIAS and the O&M, we need more training when it comes to that. I know a lot of operators don't understand it, but I think we need to do some training when it comes to that. So there should be more put towards that.
I can address that, Amy.
Okay.
The yeah, so you mentioned the O&M funding that's available this year, and true to ISK performance, they haven't allocated this year's funding yet, and already they're looking at how to allocate next year's funding, like in 2 weeks. They don't know how to allocate it, and last thing they told us was they sent resources, the funds, to the regions, and the regions are right now working on adjusting your funding, your contribution agreements to reflect 100% of the O&M from the formula funding. So adjusting it from 80 to 100%, which we still know 100% still doesn't cover everything. The other work that we're doing at the AFN is we're working on revising and reforming the operation maintenance policy, its maintenance policy. And part of that is built into it is to advocate for an asset management planning approach. In other words, First Nations to start developing plans, detailed plans of what it costs in detail to operate and maintain your systems. I think it's going to take a while to get around to that, but the several First Nations and tribal councils across the country are already doing it to some kind of fashion. The point being that moving forward, what we're advocating and pushing for Indigenous services and Canada is to provide 100% of actual costs, not 100% of the cost reference manual. And that's what we're pushing for. The other part is in order to support doing that, we're also developing some training and awareness material for First Nations. In other words, train the trainer, how to do your asset management plan. So hopefully we'll roll that out next fiscal year, sometime when the project has been developed. So we're working hard to support and advocate First Nations understanding of asset management planning approach, which is done by every other entity, municipality around the world. It's ISK is the only entity that funds from year to year. All others plan ahead of time. So we're working to support First Nations moving to a new approach. As in fact, province of Alberta has it in law, has legislated every municipality in Alberta has to have an asset management plan. And I assume the reason for that is if there's provincial funding, if the municipality does not have an asset management plan to show how they're managing and how they're going to use money, they probably won't get any money from the province.
Interesting. Tanya, I had seen your hand up earlier. Did you have a comment you wanted to make? Is she still there?
No, I guess I just wanted to say thank you for the opportunity to sit in, and I guess you could say I'm a little wet behind the ears when it comes to the water situations in all of Canada. And I do hear about it on the news and all that, but I don't really know too much about it. So I just wanted to say thank you for broadening my horizons and like opening up my eyes and definitely getting more information about this. It's like really interesting. And yeah, that's about it. Thank you.
Thank you, Tanya. And I want to thank you for that awesome pun that you just said for being wet behind the ears at the water forum. That was amazing.
You're welcome.
Are there any other comments to be made this afternoon? Any other feedback you want to give? Like I said, if you think about something in the coming days, feel free to reach out to that email address. The email address I can pop inside the chat again. So if you want to take it away, it's going to be there. water-oeau@afn.ca. So feel free to provide any future comments to there. The agenda for tomorrow is on the AFN.ca water website, and Evan has also posted it into the chat link is there as well too. Kevin, did you have any other comments or announcements that you wanted to make regarding today's session and tomorrow's session?
Yeah, just housekeeping stuff, I guess that's the main thing. Yeah, the agenda for tomorrow and link as mentioned are on that afnwater.ca site. So please check that out. I think Eva Marie from FSN has also emailed out the link as well. But yeah, in general, I just like to really thank everyone for taking time out of your days to attend. I'd especially like to thank our elder Jean for opening us up with a prayer. She'll close tomorrow as well. I'd also like to thank AFN for coordinating doing this work. You know, I think the Aspen crew has done a really good job facilitating today. So I'd like to thank them for their work today and being so organized with being able to have the breakouts transition back from the main session to the breakouts so smooth. You know, I thought the videos are great as well. You know, it's good to get that context. But you know, this is obviously going to be an ongoing thing. Like I mentioned, you know, this isn't going to be a linear process, and because things are so interdependent, you know, like we've seen come up today, you can't really talk about you know, legislation, regs, standards without looking at, you know, budgets and what you're trying to achieve, and then also, you know, practicalities like Trina was mentioning, you know, enforcement. There's so many things that need to be considered here. The advantage, I think, with water is that it is relatively self-contained in terms of treatment and wastewater. And I do think there's an opportunity here to advance our sovereignty as a result of this work. So it's an interesting time, not only just given the work that's in front of us, but also because of what's going on in the rest of the world, certainly in terms of climate, but also because there is a competition for source water. You know, there's people know what's coming. So again, thanks everyone. And yeah, we'll carry on tomorrow. Sorry for the dog barking too.
Wants to have a say too.
We don't discriminate. That's great. Thank you so much. And if there's no other comments, that's all the session that we have for today. Thank you so much for giving of your time. I know that it's very valuable. Everyone has so many competing interests. There's that website again. If you feel like you have any other further comments to make, please feel free to send them to that website. AFN will value any other input that you have to give. And that's it for us today. Now we'll go off from here at Six Nations, and hopefully we'll be able to meet sometime face to face in the future.